Right now, someone with half your talent is outperforming you. Not because they work harder, not because they got lucky, not because the world handed them something it didn't hand you. They're outperforming you because of something quieter than that, something that happens before the work begins, before the opportunity arrives, before anyone else is even watching. It happens inside the mind, and most people never learn to see it. Here's what the research actually shows, and this is the part most productivity books skip over. The gap between high achievers and everyone else is not primarily a skills gap. It's not a knowledge gap. It's not even a discipline gap, at least not in the way most people think. According to decades of research in performance psychology, the primary differentiator between people who consistently win and people who consistently plateau is something called mental architecture, the invisible framework through which a person interprets experience, talks to themselves, and decides what's possible. That architecture is built from habits. Quiet ones that don't show up on a resume or get praised on social media. Habits that operate in the background every single day, shaping how you respond to fear, how you process failure, where you direct your attention, and, most importantly, who you believe yourself to be. This audiobook is about those 7 habits, not 7 generic principles you've heard dressed in different clothing. These are 7 specific, psychologically grounded mental practices that high performers across business, athletics, the arts, and science have been found to share. Some of them will feel counterintuitive. One of them might even make you a little uncomfortable. Good. That discomfort means it's relevant. Let's be clear about what this is not. This is not a motivational speech. You don't need to be fired up right now. You need to understand something. And once you understand it, really understand it, the motivation tends to take care of itself. You also don't need to be broken to benefit from what's here. Maybe you're already successful by most measures, but you know there's a ceiling you keep bumping into. Maybe you've read the books, done the courses, and still feel like something essential is missing. Maybe you're just starting out, and you want to build the mental foundation right from the beginning, instead of spending a decade unlearning the wrong habits later. Whoever you are, if you're listening to this, you've already done something most people won't do today. You chose to invest in how you think, not just what you do. That distinction matters more than you know. Over the next several chapters, we're going to move through each of the 7 habits methodically. Each one builds on the last. Each one is designed to be immediately applicable, not someday, not after you've restructured your life, but today, in the situation you're already in. We'll start with identity, because nothing else lands properly until that foundation is in place. Then we'll move through the way you talk to yourself, the way you relate to fear, how you metabolize failure, where you place your focus, how you build psychological resilience, and finally, how you encode all of it into daily practice so it stops being effortful and starts being automatic. 7 habits, 1 operating system. Let's begin. Chapter 1, the identity habit. Winners decide who they are before they decide what to do. A study published in the British Journal of Health Psychology gave 2 groups of people the same goal: exercise at least once a week. The first group was told to motivate themselves by thinking about why exercise was important. The second group was given 1 additional instruction. They were asked to complete a sentence. During the next week, I will exercise on day, at time, in place. The third group, however, was given something different entirely. They weren't asked about motivation or scheduling. They were simply told to read a pamphlet about exercise and then complete this sentence: I am the kind of person who prioritizes their health. That third group outperformed the others significantly, not because they were more disciplined, not because their schedules were better organized, but because they had done something subtle and profound. They had made a claim about their identity before they made a claim about their behavior. This is the first habit, and it's the one most people never consciously install. Here's what no one tells you about goals. Behavior follows identity, not the other way around. Most people set a goal and then try to force themselves to act in alignment with it through willpower. They want to be a writer, so they try to make themselves write. They want to be an athlete, so they drag themselves to the gym. They want to be a disciplined professional, so they rely on to-do lists and accountability apps to override their resistance. It works, temporarily, until the willpower runs out, which it always does, because willpower is a finite resource. The psychologist Roy Baumeister spent years documenting this, the phenomenon known as ego depletion. And while the science has been refined since, the core insight holds. Relying on force to change behavior is a losing strategy over the long term. Winners operate differently. They don't use their identity as a reward to be earned after the behavior. They use it as the starting point of the behavior. Ask someone who consistently wakes up early why they do it, and they won't say, because I'm trying to build a habit. They'll say something like, I'm a morning person. Ask a successful entrepreneur why they push through rejection, and they won't describe a technique. They'll say something that sounds almost boring in its simplicity. I just see myself as someone who doesn't quit. That's not arrogance. That's architecture. The Japanese concept of ikigai, often translated as reason for being, points to something adjacent here. The people most committed to mastery in Japanese culture aren't motivated primarily by outcomes. They're motivated by alignment, the sense that what they do every day is a direct expression of who they are. A master swordsmith in Kyoto doesn't hammer steel because they're trying to achieve a result. They hammer steel because they are a craftsperson. The work is identity made visible. This is the shift from I'm trying to get fit to I'm a person who takes care of their body. From I'm working on my communication skills to I'm someone who thinks carefully before they speak. The goal doesn't disappear, but it stops being the engine. Identity becomes the engine. The goal becomes the natural output. Now, here's the part that trips people up. Most people think identity is something you discover, not something you build. They wait to feel like a certain kind of person before they claim the identity. They want evidence first, proof that they've earned the label. That's backwards. Research in behavioral psychology, particularly James Clear's synthesis of identity-based habit formation, shows that identity is built through small, repeated acts of casting votes for who you are. You want to become someone who finishes what they start. So you finish something small today, not because it matters in itself, but because it's a vote. Over time, those votes accumulate. The brain starts to say, this is what people like me do. The Stoic philosophers had a version of this too. Marcus Aurelius, writing in his personal journals, not for an audience, but for himself, would remind himself daily of who he was trying to be, not what he was trying to achieve, who he was. Waste no more time arguing about what a good person should be, he wrote. Be one. The average performer waits to feel ready. The high performer acts from a chosen identity, and the feeling follows. So how do you actually do this? Not abstractly, but concretely. Start with one sentence. A declaration, not an aspiration. Not, I want to become more focused, but I am someone who protects their attention. Not, I'm trying to be more resilient, but I am someone who gets back up. Write it somewhere you'll see it. Say it before you begin work, not as a mantra, but as a reminder of the frame you're operating inside. Then let your smallest decisions become evidence for that claim. Every time you honor that identity, even in a tiny way, you're reinforcing the architecture. And every time you violate it, you're not failing. You're just casting a different vote. One vote doesn't decide an election. The people who seem effortlessly consistent aren't fighting themselves every day. They've simply built an identity strong enough that most of the fight never starts. One thing you can do today, write down one identity statement, not a goal, but a claim about who you are. I am someone who. Make it true in at least one small way before this day ends. Chapter 2. The Self-Talk Habit. The voice in your head is either your best coach or your worst opponent, and you hired it. Picture two athletes preparing for the same competition. Same training history, same physical condition, same amount of sleep the night before. In the locker room, 30 minutes before they compete, one of them is running a loop through their mind that sounds something like this. What if I choke? I always mess up the critical moments. Last time was a disaster. I'm not sure I'm ready for this. The other is doing something different, not pumping themselves up with hollow affirmations, but running a quiet, specific mental checklist. I know what I'm doing. I've done this before. Whatever happens, I respond. The second athlete wins more often. Not always, but significantly more often. And what separates them has nothing to do with talent. In 2011, a research team at the University of Thessaly published findings that would reshape how sports psychologists approach mental preparation. They studied the effect of what they called instructional self-talk, specific, directive internal phrases, versus motivational self-talk, versus no deliberate self-talk at all. The results were clear. Athletes who used structured, instructional self-talk showed measurable improvements in performance across precision and endurance tasks. More strikingly, the effect held even when the tasks were entirely new. The self-talk wasn't just managing anxiety. It was actively shaping execution. But here's what the study couldn't fully capture. Most people's self-talk is not deliberate at all. It's automatic. It's the accumulated residue of every criticism absorbed in childhood, every failure that wasn't properly processed, every comparison made against someone else's highlight reel. It runs in the background like an app you never opened but never closed, quietly draining resources and distorting perception. The first habit was about identity, deciding who you are. This habit is about language. Because identity without language is architecture without materials. The way you talk to yourself is the primary mechanism through which your sense of self either solidifies or erodes, day by day, decision by decision. Most people treat self-talk as a reflection of how they feel. Winners treat it as a tool that shapes how they perform. That distinction is everything. Think about the last time you made a mistake, a real one, something that cost you something. What was the first thing your inner voice said? For most people, it sounds something like, "I can't believe I did that. That was so stupid. Of course that happened." And then it escalates. The mistake becomes evidence of a pattern. The pattern becomes evidence of a flaw. The flaw starts to feel permanent. This is what psychologists call a negative attribution spiral. And it is, almost universally, the internal experience of people who stay stuck. The mistake doesn't just happen. It gets narrated into a story about identity. And once that story is in place, behavior starts conforming to it. High performers make mistakes at roughly the same rate as everyone else. That's not the difference. The difference is what happens in the 30 seconds after the mistake. A study of elite tennis players, conducted by sports psychologist James Lure, found that the single most predictive behavior separating top-ranked players from mid-ranked players wasn't their forehand or their footwork. It was their between-point behavior. The top performers had almost identical physiological responses in the 16 seconds between points. They relaxed their shoulders, slowed their breathing, and, crucially, their facial expressions showed something close to neutrality. Not forced positivity. Neutrality. They had trained their self-talk to reset rather than ruminate. This is the model. Not toxic positivity. Not telling yourself everything is fine when it isn't. Neutrality as the baseline and precision as the upgrade. Here's what the self-talk of elite performers actually sounds like across domains. It is notably undramatic. An entrepreneur walking into a difficult negotiation isn't thinking, "I am amazing and I will crush this." They're thinking, "I know this material. I've prepared. I'll listen first." A surgeon preparing for a complex procedure isn't firing themselves up. They're running through the steps with calm, procedural focus. A writer sitting down with a blank page isn't declaring their genius to themselves. They're thinking, "Just start." The first sentence doesn't have to be good. Specific, instructional, present tense, quiet. This is what separates the mental script of a high performer from the mental script of someone who sabotages themselves. And the most important word in that sentence is script. Because scripts are not fixed. Scripts can be rewritten. Here's the practical architecture of a better self-talk system, distilled from performance psychology research and the testimony of high achievers across fields. The first layer is awareness. You cannot change a conversation you haven't noticed is happening. Most people are inside their self-talk, not observing it. The practice of stepping back, even briefly, even imperfectly, and noticing the quality of your inner commentary is itself a significant intervention. Not judging it, just seeing it. The second layer is interruption. When you catch a destructive loop, you don't argue with it, because arguing with an automatic thought gives it energy. You redirect. Some people use a physical cue, pressing two fingers together, or shifting posture. Some people use a single word, reset. The specific mechanism matters less than the consistency of using it. The third layer is replacement. This is where most self-help advice goes wrong, because it tells people to replace negative self-talk with positive affirmations. And for many people, that feels false, and false doesn't work. The brain knows the difference between a lie and a reframe. A reframe is not, "I am incredible and everything will be fine." A reframe is, "This is hard and I know how to handle hard things." Or, "I don't know the answer yet." That's different from never knowing it. Or simply, "Next play." The language is small. The effect, compounded over months and years, is not. One more thing worth naming. The Zen Buddhist tradition has a concept called Shoshin, beginner's mind. The idea is that the expert's mind sees few possibilities because it's filtered through assumptions, while the beginner's mind sees many. When your self-talk is locked in a story about your limitations, you are operating with expert's mind about yourself, certain of what you can't do, closed to evidence that contradicts it. Beginner's mind in self-talk sounds like, "I haven't figured this out yet." 5 words. Entirely different relationship to difficulty. The voice in your head is not reporting the truth. It is constructing an experience of reality. That construction can work for you or against you. The difference is whether you're doing it consciously. One thing you can do today, for the next 24 hours, notice the 3 most frequent phrases your inner voice uses when something goes wrong. Don't try to change them yet, just name them. Awareness before adjustment. That's where the shift starts. Chapter 3, the fear habit. Everyone feels it. Winners just have a different relationship with it. In 1974, a 24-year-old French aerialist named Philippe Petit strung a wire between the twin towers of the World Trade Center, illegally, in secret, in the middle of the night, and the next morning walked across it. 8 times, at 1,350 feet, with no safety net. When journalists asked him afterward whether he had been afraid, he said something that stopped them cold. "Of course I was afraid. Fear is my partner. If I had no fear, I would have no respect for what I was doing. And if I had no respect, I would be dead." Most people hear that and think it's a poetic answer. It's actually a precise psychological description of how high performers relate to fear. They don't treat it as a signal to retreat. They treat it as information, specific, useful, actionable information about what matters to them and what demands their full attention. This is the third habit, and it may be the most misunderstood one. There is an entire industry built around the idea that fear is an obstacle to be eliminated. Overcome your fears. Conquer your anxiety. Push past the resistance. The language is militaristic, as if fear is an enemy to be defeated before real living can begin. And that framework, while emotionally satisfying as a narrative, is psychologically counterproductive. Here's what no one tells you. Trying to eliminate fear activates exactly the neural circuits you're trying to quiet. Neuroscientists call this the ironic process theory. The brain's attempt to suppress a thought or feeling requires it to first generate a representation of that thought or feeling and then monitor for its presence. Tell yourself not to be afraid, and the brain has to keep checking. Am I afraid yet? Am I afraid yet? The monitoring loop itself produces the very anxiety you're trying to avoid. High performers aren't less afraid. The research is consistent on this. Studies of elite athletes, combat experienced soldiers, emergency room surgeons, and veteran performers consistently show similar physiological fear responses to those of their less experienced peers. Elevated heart rate, heightened cortisol, sharpened perception. The difference is not that they feel less. The difference is in what they do with what they feel. The neuroscience here is worth understanding because it makes the habit practical rather than mystical. When you encounter something that your brain codes as threatening, a high-stakes presentation, a difficult conversation, a creative risk, your amygdala fires. Stress hormones flood your system. Your heart rate climbs. Your palms may sweat. This physiological cascade is completely involuntary and it happens in milliseconds, well before your conscious mind has formed a single thought about the situation. But, and this is the critical part, the meaning you assign to that physiological state is not automatic. It is a choice, a habit, something that can be trained. Psychologist Allison Wood Brooks at Harvard Business School ran a series of experiments in which people about to perform stressful tasks, singing in front of strangers, doing public speaking, taking a math test, were randomly assigned to one of two conditions. One group was told to say to themselves, "I am calm." The other group was told to say, "I am excited." The excited group performed measurably better across every task. Not because excitement eliminated the physiological arousal, but because excitement and anxiety are, from the body's point of view, almost identical states. Elevated heart rate, heightened attention, quickened breath, and the label you apply to that state determines whether it becomes a resource or a burden. This is what elite performers do intuitively, and what this habit trains deliberately. They don't try to slow themselves down before a high-stakes moment. They lean into the arousal and reframe it as readiness. The Stoics had a practice called premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. Every morning, Marcus Aurelius and other Stoic practitioners would mentally rehearse the worst possible outcomes of their day, not as pessimism, as preparation. The practice drained fear of its ambiguity, because ambiguous fear is always worse than specific fear. Once you have named exactly what you are afraid of, the mind stops searching for something worse. The threat is bounded. Bounded threats are manageable. This is not unlike what modern performance coaches call fear setting, the practice of writing down, with complete specificity, what you are actually afraid might happen. Not the vague dread, but the concrete scenario. And then asking, if this happened, what would I do? Almost always, the answer is something. You would do something. The situation would not be terminal. The explicit act of answering that question transforms fear from a fog into a forecast, and forecasts can be prepared for. The average person encounters fear and reads it as a verdict. This is too much for me. The high performer encounters the same fear and reads it as a briefing. This matters. Pay attention. Here is what could go wrong. Here is how to prepare. Same signal. Entirely different operating instructions. There's a third dimension to this habit that doesn't get talked about enough, and it comes from the Japanese martial arts tradition, specifically from the concept of zanshin. The word is often translated as remaining mind or lingering awareness, and it refers to a state of relaxed, total alertness that a practitioner maintains after completing a technique. Not the rigid bracing of someone bracing against fear, but the open readiness of someone who has made peace with uncertainty and therefore can respond to it clearly. Zanshin is the opposite of the white-knuckle approach to fear. It is not suppression and it is not surrender. It is a trained willingness to remain present with discomfort without being consumed by it. In practice, it looks like the surgeon who acknowledges that a procedure is high risk without catastrophizing. The entrepreneur who sees clearly that a deal might fall apart without spiraling into paralysis. The athlete who feels their heart pounding before competition and thinks, simply, "Good, I'm ready." Fear, in this framework, is not the opposite of confidence. It is one of its ingredients. What separates the people who act in spite of fear from the people who are stopped by it is not courage in the dramatic, Hollywood sense of the word. It is something smaller and more repeatable than that. It is the habit of taking one step into the fear before the mind has finished its argument about why you shouldn't. Just one step, and then another. And the fear, in almost every case, does not grow. It transforms. One thing you can do today: name one thing you've been avoiding because of fear. Write down, in a single specific sentence, what you are actually afraid will happen. Then write, "If that happened, I would." Finish the sentence honestly. You'll notice the fear is smaller than the avoidance made it feel. Chapter 4. The Failure Habit. Everyone fails. The question is what you do with it in the next 24 hours. In 1965, a young engineer at a consumer products company submitted a proposal for a new type of adhesive. It was, by conventional standards, a failure. The glue he had developed didn't bond permanently. It peeled off cleanly. It left no residue. It was, in the language of the lab report, insufficiently strong for commercial application. The proposal was shelved. The engineer, Spencer Silver, moved on to other projects. But he didn't forget the adhesive. For years, he kept talking about it internally, quietly, persistently. without a clear vision of what it was for, until a colleague named Art Fry, frustrated one Sunday morning by bookmarks that kept falling out of his hymnal, remembered Silver's strange, useless glue and thought, what if the failure was actually the feature? The Post-it note was born from a misclassified success. This story is often told as a lesson about creativity or serendipity. But look at it more carefully, and it's really a story about how high performers relate to failure. Spencer Silver didn't bury the result, didn't reframe it as something other than a failure, didn't pretend it hadn't happened. He held it lightly. He stayed curious about it. He let it remain in circulation in his mind without demanding that it immediately resolve into a win. That is a mental habit, and it is rarer than it sounds. Here is the uncomfortable truth about failure that most frameworks, motivational, professional, therapeutic, tend to talk around. Failure is not inherently instructive. The idea that failure always teaches you something, that every setback contains a lesson, that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, these are not laws of nature. They are outcomes of a specific way of processing failure, a way that can be learned, a way that most people never learn. Research by Stanford psychologist Carol Dweck on what she called growth mindset revealed something important that often gets flattened in popular retellings. The finding was not simply that believing you can improve leads to better outcomes, although it does. The more precise finding was about the response to failure specifically. In her studies, participants with a growth orientation showed a different neurological signature when they encountered mistakes. Their brain showed heightened attention to the error-related negativity signal, a brain wave associated with error detection, compared to participants with a fixed mindset. They were, in a literal neurological sense, more interested in their mistakes, not more comfortable with them, more interested. That distinction matters enormously. Comfort with failure is not the goal. Curiosity about failure is. The people who let failure become a ceiling are not people who feel bad about failing. Feeling bad about failure is human and appropriate. They are people who, after feeling bad, then do one of two things. They either ruminate, replaying the failure in a loop that generates shame without generating insight, or they dismiss, moving on so quickly that the failure deposits no learning at all. High performers do neither. They grieve the failure briefly, because grief is honest, and then they do something very specific. They interrogate it. Not harshly, not in the spirit of self-punishment. In the spirit of a scientist examining unexpected data. The questions are different from the ones most people ask. The average person asks, "Why did this happen to me? What does this say about me? How could I have been so stupid?" These are questions that funnel toward identity and generate shame. The high performer asks, "What actually happened?" as specifically as possible. What did I assume that turned out to be wrong? What would I do differently if I ran this again from the same starting point? Same event, completely different cognitive architecture. One extracts information, the other extracts suffering. Michael Jordan was cut from his high school varsity basketball team. This story has been told so many times it has almost lost its meaning. But the detail worth focusing on is not that he was cut. It's what he reportedly did with the rejection. He didn't go home and reframe it as a gift, or tell himself it didn't matter, or decide the coach was wrong. He went home and felt the humiliation of it completely. And then, by his own account, he used it. He referenced that moment of rejection throughout his career, not as a wound he carried, but as a coordinate system. A reference point for what it felt like to not be selected, and what he was willing to do to make sure it never happened again. The failure didn't disappear. It got metabolized. This is the mechanism. Not forgetting, not transcending, metabolizing, extracting what is nutritive from the experience and releasing what is toxic. And like any metabolic process, it takes time, it takes specific conditions, and it cannot be rushed. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus, who was born a slave, lost his freedom, and built one of the most influential philosophical frameworks in Western history, taught a concept he called the dichotomy of control. Some things are within your power, your judgments, your intentions, your responses. Some things are not. Outcomes, other people's behavior, external events. Failure almost always involves both. There are things you did that contributed to it, and things you could not have controlled. The high performer's post-failure process separates these two categories clearly, because only the first category contains actionable information. Collapsing both categories into a single story of "I failed" means either taking responsibility for things outside your control, which is demoralizing, or avoiding responsibility for things within your control, which is just dishonest. Neither produces growth. Here is the practical shape of what this habit looks like when it's fully installed. Within 24 hours of a significant failure, high performers tend to do some version of the following. They allow the emotional response to exist without amplifying it. They create some distance from the event, often physical, a walk, a change of environment, before attempting to analyze it. They write or speak about it in factual rather than evaluative language. And they identify one, at most two, specific changes to make before attempting the same challenge again. That's it. Not a grand philosophical reckoning. Not a complete reinvention of self. One or two specific adjustments, implemented quickly before the next attempt. Because the next attempt is the most important part. The failure habit is not complete until you've gone back. The people who never recover from failure are often not the ones who felt the worst in the aftermath. They're the ones who waited too long to try again. The longer the gap between failure and re-engagement, the more the fear calcifies, the more the story about the failure settles into something fixed. In Japanese culture, there is a concept called kaizen, often translated as continuous improvement, but more literally meaning change for the better. Its original application was industrial, but its psychological implication is profound. Improvement is not a series of dramatic leaps. It is a commitment to small, regular, incremental adjustments made in response to what reality keeps showing you. Failure, in this framework, is not an interruption to the process. It is the primary mechanism of the process. You don't learn to walk and then stop falling. You fall, adjust, take another step, fall again, adjust again. This is not a metaphor for resilience. It is the literal neurological mechanism by which motor skills are acquired. And it is, with modifications, the same mechanism by which every complex human skill, professional, relational, creative, is built. Failure is not the opposite of winning. It is, for the people who know how to use it, one of its primary ingredients. One thing you can do today. Think of one recent failure or setback, something still unresolved in your mind. Write 3 sentences about it, each one beginning with, "What actually happened was." Then write one sentence beginning with, "The one thing within my control that I would change is." That's the whole exercise. 5 sentences. But notice how different it feels to end on that last one. Chapter 5. The Focus Habit. Being busy is easy. Being productive is a choice almost no one makes deliberately. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with how much you've worked. You know the feeling. You've been moving all day, emails answered, meetings attended, tasks crossed off, messages replied to. And by evening you sit down and feel, beneath the tiredness, something closer to emptiness. A vague sense that the day went somewhere without you. That you were busy but not quite present for any of it. That the motion was real but the meaning was somehow absent. That feeling is not laziness. It is not ingratitude. It is the accurate perception of a mind that has been reactive all day rather than intentional. And in the modern world, that is the default state, not the exception. Here is the thing about busyness that almost no one says directly. Busyness is a form of avoidance. Not always, but more often than most people are comfortable admitting. Filling your hours with low-stakes activity creates the sensation of forward movement while protecting you from the higher-stakes work that actually requires something from you. Creative risk, sustained concentration, the discomfort of attempting something you might fail at. A packed calendar is, for many high-functioning people, a very sophisticated defense mechanism. The average performer measures their day by volume. How much they did, how many things they handled, how full the schedule was. The high performer measures their day by a different metric entirely. What moved? Not what was touched, but what actually advanced. Not what was responded to, but what was created or decided or built. This single shift in measurement changes everything about how a day is designed. Cal Newport, a computer scientist who has written extensively on the nature of deep work, draws a distinction that is worth sitting with. The difference between deep work, cognitively demanding tasks performed in a state of distraction-free concentration, and shallow work, logistical, communicative, low cognitive load tasks that keep the operation running but don't generate lasting value. His argument, backed by both research and extensive interviews with high performers across fields, is that the capacity for deep work is becoming simultaneously rarer and more valuable. The people who can do it consistently are pulling away from everyone else, not because they're smarter, but because they've protected something that most people have surrendered without realizing it. That thing is attention, and attention, it turns out, is not just a resource. It is the resource. Everything else you bring to a challenge, intelligence, skill, experience, creativity, is mediated by where and how you direct your attention. The neuroscience of this is illuminating. The prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for complex reasoning, decision-making, and creative thinking, does not multitask. This is not a metaphor or an approximation. It is a structural fact. What we experience as multitasking is actually a rapid series of attentional switches, each one carrying a cognitive cost that researchers call switching overhead. Every time your attention shifts from one task to another, it takes between 15 and 23 minutes, according to research from the University of California, Irvine, for the brain to return to full depth of engagement on the original task. Read that again. 15 to 23 minutes for a single interruption. Now think about a typical workday. The average knowledge worker, according to multiple studies conducted in the 2010s and 2020s, is interrupted or self-interrupts every 3 to 5 minutes, which means that for most people, the brain never actually reaches full depth on anything. It spends the entire day skimming the surface of its own capability, generating the sensation of busyness while operating at a fraction of its actual power. This is not a technology problem, although technology accelerates it. It is a habit problem. Specifically, it is the absence of the focus habit. So what does the focus habit actually look like in practice? Not as an ideal, but as a daily structure? The first principle is selection before scheduling. Before any day begins, ideally the evening before, the high performer identifies the single most important thing that needs to move forward. Not the most urgent, not the most requested, the most important. There is almost always a gap between these categories, and most people fill their days from the urgent pile while the important pile quietly accumulates. The focus habit starts with the courage to schedule the important thing first, before the urgent things crowd it out. The second principle is time blocking with intention. Not time management in the generic sense of organizing tasks, but the deliberate creation of protected intervals. 90 minutes is the length most consistently cited in research on cognitive performance, during which the important work gets done without interruption. Phone face down, notifications off, a clear, single objective. This sounds simple. It is simple. It is also, for most people, genuinely difficult to sustain because it requires tolerating the discomfort of not being available, not responding immediately, not knowing what you're missing. That discomfort is information. It tells you how conditioned you've become to the dopamine loop of constant connectivity. The third principle is strategic incompleteness. This one comes from an unexpected place. The novelist Ernest Hemingway, who reportedly stopped writing each day not when he had exhausted an idea, but in the middle of a sentence he knew how to finish. His reasoning was that the incomplete thought would pull him back to the work the next morning with momentum rather than anxiety. Psychologists have a name for this phenomenon: the Zeigarnik effect, the brain's tendency to maintain active, low-level processing of incomplete tasks. Used deliberately, it is a focus amplifier. You don't close the loop at the end of a work session. You leave a thread deliberately unresolved, and your subconscious keeps working on it while you're doing other things. This is not about working longer. It is about working in a way that harnesses the full architecture of how the brain actually operates. The fourth principle, and perhaps the most important, is protecting the first hour. Before the world gets access to your attention, before the phone is checked, before the inbox is opened, before the news is consumed, There is a window of time in which your mind is most capable of original, generative thought. Neuroscientists attribute this partly to residual activity from REM sleep, during which the brain consolidates learning and makes novel connections between disparate concepts. The high performer treats this window as sacred, not because of a productivity rule, but because they have experienced, through direct observation of their own output, that the work they do in this window is qualitatively different from the work they do 3 hours later, after the world has had its way with their attention. The average person gives this window to their phone within the first 4 minutes of waking. Research from the mobile analytics firm IDC found that more than 80% of smartphone users check their device before they've been awake for 15 minutes. Every single one of those people is spending their most cognitively powerful window of the day processing other people's agendas rather than their own. There is a concept in Zen Buddhism called ichigyozumai, total absorption in a single act. The practitioner gives themselves completely to what is in front of them, not planning the next thing, not reviewing the last thing, not managing the perception of the thing, just the thing itself, fully inhabited. It is, stripped of its spiritual framing, a description of what neuroscientists call a flow state, the condition of optimal performance in which skill and challenge are in balance, self-consciousness recedes, and output quality rises dramatically. Flow cannot be forced, but it can be invited. And the primary invitation is the removal of competition for your attention. You are not behind because you lack talent. You are not behind because you don't work hard enough. You may be behind because your attention, your most finite, most powerful, most renewable resource, is being distributed across so many inputs that no single output ever receives enough of it to become remarkable. The focus habit is not about doing more. It is about doing less, better, on purpose. One thing you can do today, before you open your phone or check your messages tomorrow morning, spend the first 20 minutes working on whatever you have identified as the most important thing in your life right now. Not the most urgent, the most important. Do this for 5 consecutive days and notice what changes, not just in your output, but in how you feel about your days. Chapter 6. The Discomfort Habit. You don't find your limits by staying comfortable. You find them by moving past where you thought they were. In the winter of 1914, Ernest Shackleton's ship Endurance became trapped in the pack ice of the Wetteish Sea, roughly 85 miles from the coast of Antarctica. Over the following months, the ice slowly crushed the hull. The crew watched their ship sink. They were left on the ice with 3 small lifeboats, minimal supplies, and no possibility of rescue, because no one knew where they were. What followed is one of the most documented survival stories in human history. 28 men, 22 months. Not a single fatality. When researchers and historians have studied Shackleton's leadership during this period, they keep arriving at the same observation. Shackleton did not try to protect his crew from the reality of their situation. He did not minimize the danger or manufacture false optimism. What he did, consistently and deliberately, was model a stable psychological relationship with extreme discomfort. He slept in the worst conditions. He took the most difficult watches. He ate last, not as performance, but as practice, as a daily demonstration that discomfort was not a reason to collapse, but a condition to be inhabited with dignity. His crew did not survive because they were exceptional people. Most of them were ordinary sailors. They survived because they had a leader who showed them, through repeated daily example, that discomfort was survivable, that the feeling of difficulty was not the same as the fact of impossibility. This is the 6th habit, and in some ways it is the one that makes all the others sustainable. Every previous habit we've discussed, identity, self-talk, fear, failure, focus, will eventually bring you to a moment of genuine discomfort. A moment where continuing requires something that feels, from the inside, like more than you have. The identity habit asks you to act before you feel ready. The self-talk habit asks you to interrupt patterns that have years of momentum behind them. The fear habit asks you to step forward while the alarm is still sounding. The failure habit asks you to stay curious when every instinct is pushing toward shame or retreat. The focus habit asks you to sit with the discomfort of not being immediately responsive in a world that rewards constant availability. In every case, the limiting factor is not strategy. It is the relationship with discomfort itself. Most people treat discomfort as a signal to stop. High performers have learned, through experience and, in some cases, through deliberate practice, to treat discomfort as a signal that something important is happening. Not that they should push through recklessly, but that they are at the edge of a boundary that can, with the right approach, be extended. The neuroscience of this is both humbling and empowering. Your brain has a threat detection system, centered in the amygdala, refined over millions of years of evolution, that is extraordinarily sensitive and not particularly precise. It was calibrated for an environment where physical discomfort often meant physical danger, where the appropriate response to almost any form of alarm was either fight or flight. In the modern world, that same system fires in response to a difficult conversation, a creative challenge, a physical training threshold, a public performance. The discomfort is real. The danger is usually not. But here is what makes this habit genuinely transformative. The brain is plastic. Not metaphorically plastic. Physically, structurally plastic. The neural pathways that process threat and discomfort can be literally reshaped through repeated exposure. This is what happens in effective therapy, in athletic training, in deliberate skill acquisition. The repeated encounter with a manageable level of difficulty, without catastrophe, teaches the nervous system that this level of challenge is within the range of tolerable. The threshold moves. What was once overwhelming becomes merely hard. What was merely hard becomes familiar. What was familiar becomes automatic. This process has a name in psychology: systematic desensitization in its therapeutic form, and progressive overload in its athletic form. But underneath both frameworks is the same fundamental mechanism. You extend the boundary of what your system can handle by repeatedly approaching it from just inside, with intention, without being destroyed. The key word is manageable. This is not about throwing yourself into overwhelming situations and hoping survival produces strength. That approach is as likely to produce trauma as growth. The discomfort habit is about finding the edge, the place where it is genuinely difficult but not genuinely threatening, and spending time there regularly, deliberately, with enough recovery between sessions that the system can adapt. Elite coaches in sport call this the sweet spot of difficulty, the zone in which a challenge is hard enough to demand full engagement but achievable enough to allow success with genuine effort. Too easy, and the brain doesn't adapt. There's no reason to build new capacity. Too hard, and the brain shuts down into protective mode, survival, not growth. The skill of finding and staying in that middle zone is itself a trainable habit. Here is what this looks like practically across different domains. For cognitive work, it looks like sitting with a problem a little longer than feels comfortable before reaching for help or distraction. It looks like writing the hard paragraph before editing the easy ones. It looks like making the difficult phone call at the beginning of the day rather than the end, when resistance has accumulated. For emotional work, it looks like entering a difficult conversation rather than managing around it. It looks like naming what you actually feel in a situation where the easier path is detachment. It looks like staying present with another person's distress without immediately trying to fix it. For physical work, it looks like the last 2 repetitions of an exercise that your body has already decided it wants to stop at. It looks like the final kilometer of a run when the comfortable thing would be to walk. It looks like the deliberate, regular practice of asking more from your body than it wants to give, not to punish it, but to teach it that more is available. In each domain, the mechanism is identical. You approach the boundary. You cross it slightly. You recover. You approach again. Over time, the boundary moves. The Stoic concept of ascesis, often translated as spiritual exercise, but more precisely meaning practice or training, was built around this principle. Stoic practitioners would deliberately undertake periods of voluntary discomfort, sleeping on the floor, fasting, wearing minimal clothing in cold weather, walking long distances without complaint, not as self-punishment, but as rehearsal. Rehearsal for the inevitable moments when discomfort would not be optional. The logic was elegant. If you have practiced being cold loses its power to destabilize you. If you have practiced hunger, hunger loses its power to make you desperate. You have already met these experiences. You know you can survive them. This is what Shackleton's crew had by the end of their ordeal. Not just the fact of survival, but the psychological knowledge of their own range. They knew, from direct experience, that they could endure more than they had believed they could endure. That knowledge does not leave a person. It becomes part of how they move through the world. There is a concept in Japanese ceramics called wabi-sabi, the aesthetic appreciation of imperfection and transience, particularly the beauty found in objects that show the marks of use, age, and repair. A bowl that has been cracked and repaired with gold, a practice called kintsugi, is considered more beautiful for having been broken because the repair is visible, honest, and stronger than the original clay. This is not sentimentality. It is a precise description of what happens to a person who has developed a healthy relationship with discomfort. They do not hide their difficulty. They do not pretend the hard moments didn't happen. They carry the evidence of having moved through difficult things, and that evidence makes them structurally stronger, more credible to themselves, more trustworthy to others, more capable of the next hard thing. The psychological immune system is not built in comfortable conditions any more than the physical immune system is built in a sterile environment. It requires exposure, managed exposure with recovery over time. But here is the thing about starting this habit that most people don't expect. It does not require a dramatic challenge. It does not require Shackleton's ice or a military test or a life-altering ordeal. It requires only that you find, today, one thing that is at your edge, one small thing that you would normally avoid because it is uncomfortable, and do that thing deliberately. The size of the discomfort matters less than the consistency of choosing it. One thing you can do today. Identify one thing you have been avoiding specifically because it is uncomfortable, not because it is impossible, not because the timing is wrong, but because it feels hard. Do it today before the day ends. Not to prove something, just to remind your nervous system that discomfort is not the same as danger. Chapter 7. The Ritual Habit. What you do in the first and last 10 minutes of each day quietly determines everything in between. There is a photograph taken in the early 1960s of the composer Igor Stravinsky sitting at his piano at precisely 8:30 in the morning. Not performing, not composing, just sitting, warming up, running the same scales and exercises he had run every morning for decades. His housekeeper reportedly said that she could set her watch by him, not because Stravinsky was obsessive, but because the ritual was the point. The repetition was the point. The act of entering the work the same way, every day, regardless of inspiration or mood or circumstance, was how one of the 20th century's most original creative minds kept the channel open. When asked about it, Stravinsky was characteristically direct. I get up at 8, and I immediately work. I don't wait for inspiration. Inspiration is for amateurs. The rest of us just show up and get to work. That sentence contains an entire philosophy of peak performance, compressed into 2 lines. And the philosophy is this: ritual is not the enemy of spontaneity. It is the infrastructure that makes sustained high performance possible. We have spent the previous 6 chapters building a mental architecture: identity, self-talk, fear, failure, focus, discomfort. Each habit is psychologically sound. Each one, if genuinely practiced, will change how you operate. But there is a persistent problem with insight. It doesn't automatically translate into behavior. You can understand something deeply and still not do it. The gap between knowing and doing is one of the most thoroughly studied problems in behavioral psychology, and the most consistently effective bridge across that gap is not motivation. It is not willpower. It is not even accountability, although that helps. It is ritual. Specifically, the kind of small, repeated, intentional practice that happens at the same time, in the same sequence, with enough regularity that it stops requiring a decision. Here's what no one tells you about high performers and their daily routines. The rituals themselves are almost never impressive. They are not elaborate. They do not require special equipment or extended time blocks or perfect conditions. They are, almost universally, small. What makes them powerful is not their complexity, but their consistency and the specific psychological functions they serve. Let's look at those functions clearly, because this is where most conversations about morning routines go wrong. The popular version of the ritual habit has been distorted by social media into something performative, a 2-hour gauntlet of cold plunges, journaling, meditation, exercise, reading, visualization, and gratitude practice, all before 7 in the morning. This version is mostly theater. It is optimized for appearance rather than for the actual psychological mechanisms that rituals serve. Those mechanisms are 3, and each one maps directly to the habits we've already built. The first mechanism is state priming, the deliberate calibration of your mental and emotional state before you encounter the day's challenges. Every high performer, regardless of field, has some version of this. The surgeon who reviews the procedure quietly before entering the operating room. The athlete who runs the same warm-up sequence before every competition. The writer who makes coffee in exactly the same way and sits in exactly the same chair before beginning. None of these actions are intrinsically meaningful. What they do is signal to the nervous system. This is what we do before we perform. Over time, the ritual becomes a trigger. The act of doing it begins to produce the state it was originally intended to cultivate. The nervous system learns the sequence and starts preparing before the conscious mind has even finished the ritual. This is classical conditioning in the most practical possible form. And it takes almost no time. The surgeon's pre-procedure review takes under 3 minutes. The athlete's warm-up sequence under 5. The second mechanism is cognitive clearing, the practice of externalizing what is in your mind so that working memory is freed for the actual work ahead. The most common form of this is some variation of a brief morning rite. Not journaling in the expressive, therapeutic sense, but a rapid, unfiltered download of whatever is occupying mental bandwidth. Unfinished tasks, anxieties, decisions pending, distractions anticipated. Getting them out of the head and onto a page, physical or digital, is neurologically equivalent to moving items from active RAM to external storage. The processing load drops. Attention becomes available. Research on what psychologist Sion Beilock calls choking under pressure consistently shows that performance failures in high-stakes situations are often not failures of skill, but failures of working memory. The mind is so preoccupied with monitoring its own performance, managing anxiety, and processing intrusive thoughts that insufficient cognitive resources remain for the task itself. The cognitive clearing ritual addresses this directly before the stakes arrive. The third mechanism is intentional closure, and this is the one most people skip entirely because it happens at the end of the day when energy is low and the temptation is simply to stop. But the closing ritual may be, psychologically, more important than the opening one. Here's why. The brain does not naturally distinguish between finished and stopped. When you simply stop working at the end of a day, close the laptop, put down the phone, walk away, the open loops of the day remain active in your cognitive background. They continue consuming mental energy. They surface during downtime, during meals, during conversations, during the early stages of sleep. This is why so many high-functioning people describe being unable to fully rest. Not because they are workaholics by temperament, but because they have no reliable mechanism for signaling to the brain that the workday is genuinely over. A closing ritual, even one that takes under 5 minutes, creates that signal. It might be as simple as writing tomorrow's 3 most important tasks, closing all open browser tabs, saying out loud, or in writing something like "shutdown complete," and then not reopening work-related material until the next morning. The specific content matters less than the consistency of the sequence. Over time, the ritual teaches the brain that this sequence means we are done. Attention can be released. Computer scientist and author Cal Newport has practiced and written about a version of this for years, and the effect he describes is not marginal. It is, he reports, transformative for the quality of his evenings and his sleep, and consequently for the quality of his mornings. Now, how do you actually build these rituals in a way that sticks? Because intention is not the problem. Most people have good intentions about their routines. The problem is the architecture of the habit itself. The behavioral science here is clear. Rituals stick when they are anchored to existing behaviors, kept small enough that the activation energy required to begin them is nearly zero, and repeated consistently enough that the brain begins to automate them. The psychologist B.J. Fogg calls the anchoring technique habit stacking, attaching a new behavior to an existing one so that the existing behavior becomes the trigger. Not, I will meditate every morning, which is too vague to be reliable. But after I pour my first cup of coffee, I will sit for 3 minutes and write down the one thing that matters most today. The coffee is already happening. The new ritual rides the existing behavior's momentum. The Buddhist concept of Sammu, mindful work practice, offers a useful frame here. In Zen monasteries, daily tasks like cooking, cleaning, and gardening are treated not as interruptions to spiritual practice, but as the practice itself. The ritual is not separate from the life. It is the life made conscious. The monk washing dishes is not waiting to finish so they can meditate. The washing is the meditation. The same principle applies to a high performer's daily rituals. They are not preparation for the real thing. They are, themselves, the real thing. They are the daily act of taking the life you want to live seriously enough to show up for it with intention every day, regardless of how you feel. Because this is the final, essential truth about the ritual habit, it is not mood-dependent. That is precisely its value. Stravinsky sat at the piano at 8:30 not because he felt like it. He sat at the piano at 8:30 because it was 8:30. The ritual held the behavior in place while the motivation came and went, as motivation always does. You will not always feel like protecting your attention. You will not always feel like resetting after a failure. You will not always feel like choosing discomfort. The rituals are what you do when the feeling isn't there. They are the system that runs the habits when the habits themselves require too much decision-making energy to initiate from scratch. And here is what makes them extraordinary over time. They compound, not dramatically, not in ways that are visible week to week. But a person who has spent 3 years doing a 5-minute morning intention ritual and a 4-minute evening closure ritual has, in that time, spent roughly 60 hours in deliberate, intentional relationship with their own mind. 60 hours of practicing self-direction, of choosing how to enter and exit each day, of treating the architecture of their attention as something worth tending. That is not nothing. That is, quietly, everything. One thing you can do today: design a morning ritual that takes under 10 minutes. It needs exactly 3 components. One thing that primes your state, one thing that clears your mind, and one thing that sets your single most important intention for the day. Write it down tonight. Do it tomorrow morning before you check your phone. Do it again the day after. Don't optimize it for the first 2 weeks. Just do it. Conclusion: the system is already inside you. Now it's time to run it. Think back to where you were when you pressed play on this audiobook. Maybe you were commuting, half present, half somewhere else in your mind. Maybe you were at the gym, or walking, or sitting in a room you needed to escape for an hour. Maybe you came with a specific problem, a career that feels stalled, a pattern you can't seem to break, a version of yourself you keep glimpsing but can't quite reach. Or maybe you came with something vaguer than that, a feeling, the persistent, low-grade sense that you are capable of more than your current results suggest, and that the gap between the two is somehow your fault, even though you can't quite name what you're doing wrong. Whatever brought you here, something in you recognized that the answer wasn't going to come from working harder. You've tried that. Most people reading this have already tried that. Hard work is not the variable that's missing. You knew, on some level, that the answer was going to require looking somewhere most people don't look, inward, at the architecture of thought itself. That instinct was correct. Over the last 7 chapters, we have moved through 7 mental habits that quietly separate high performers from everyone else. Not 7 motivational concepts. Not 7 things to feel good about. 7 specific, psychologically grounded practices that change how a mind operates, and therefore change what a mind produces. Let's bring them together one final time, not as a list, but as a system, because that is what they are. They are not independent. They reinforce each other. They build on each other. And understanding how they connect is what transforms 7 individual habits into a single, coherent mental operating system. It begins with identity, the decision made before any action about who you are. This is the foundation. Without it, every other habit is being built on sand. When you know who you are, not who you're trying to become, but who you have chosen to be right now, as a claim you are actively defending through your daily behavior, the other habits have something to attach to. Your self-talk becomes a defense of that identity rather than an attack on it. Your relationship with fear changes because fear no longer threatens your sense of self. It simply signals that something important is at stake. Failure becomes data rather than verdict because a single outcome cannot define someone whose identity is built on a pattern, not a result. Focus becomes natural because someone who knows who they are also knows what matters to them. And knowing what matters makes the decision about where to put attention far simpler. Discomfort becomes acceptable because growth is part of the identity. And ritual becomes the daily act of honoring that identity, of showing up for it, even when nothing external is requiring you to. Pull on any one of these habits and you feel the others move. That is not an accident. That is the nature of a system. Here is something worth naming directly, because it tends to come up at this point in any honest conversation about performance psychology. You will not install all 7 of these habits at once. Not because you aren't capable, but because that is not how lasting behavioral change works. Trying to rebuild your entire mental operating system in a single week is the psychological equivalent of trying to renovate every room in your house simultaneously. You end up with everything torn apart and nothing functional. The research on habit formation, from the work of Philippa Lally at University College London, whose studies found that new habits take anywhere from 18 to 254 days to become automatic, with a median around 66 days, consistently points to the same conclusion. One change, installed deeply, is worth more than 7 changes installed shallowly. The goal is not to collect habits. The goal is to become someone for whom these habits are simply how they operate. So where do you start? Start where the friction is. Not where the concept is most interesting, not where the change seems most dramatic, but where you feel the most resistance in your current daily life. That resistance is almost always pointing at the habit that would create the most leverage for you right now. If you find yourself constantly derailed by the aftermath of failure, Chapter 4 is your starting point. If your days feel full but empty, Chapter 5 is where the work begins. If you feel like you keep performing below what you know you're capable of under pressure, Chapter 2, the self-talk habit, is the thread to pull first. One habit, 60 days of genuine practice. Then the next. This is not a slow approach. This is the fastest approach because it is the only one that actually works. Now, there is something else that needs to be said, and it is perhaps the least comfortable thing in this entire audiobook. So stay with it. Every habit we have discussed is a choice. Not a choice made once, dramatically, in a moment of peak motivation. A choice made quietly, repeatedly, in the ordinary moments when no one is watching and nothing external is demanding it. The choice to hold your identity with intention rather than letting it be defined by whatever just happened. The choice to interrupt a destructive internal narrative rather than following it to its familiar destination. The choice to step toward the thing that frightens you rather than managing your life around it. The choice to stay curious about failure rather than becoming its prisoner. The choice to protect your attention rather than surrendering it to whatever is loudest. The choice to move toward discomfort rather than away from it. The choice to show up for your rituals on the days when nothing in you wants to. These choices will not always feel meaningful in the moment. Most of them will feel small, unremarkable, barely worth noting. And that is exactly the point, because the extraordinary results that high performers produce are almost never the product of single extraordinary moments. They are the accumulated product of thousands of small, unremarkable choices made in alignment with a clear sense of who they are and what they are building. The Japanese have a word, shokunin, that is typically translated as craftsperson or artisan, but its meaning is richer than that. A shokunin is someone who has dedicated themselves completely to the mastery of a single practice, not for recognition, not for outcome, but out of a deep sense of responsibility to the work itself and to the people the work serves. The sushi chef Jiro Ono, whose decades of practice became the subject of a documentary, has said that he dreams about sushi, not because he is obsessed in an unhealthy sense, but because his identity, his attention, and his daily rituals have aligned so completely that there is no separation between who he is and what he does. The work is the life. The life is the work. You do not need to be Jiro Ono. You do not need to spend decades in singular pursuit of a single craft. But you do need, if you want to perform at the level you are capable of, to bring something of that spirit to how you think. To take your mind seriously as a craft. To treat the habits of thought not as nice-to-haves, but as the primary technology through which you build everything else. Because here is the final truth, the one that sits underneath all 7 habits and makes them make sense. Your external results are a lagging indicator of your internal habits. Always, without exception. The business results, the career trajectory, the relationships, the creative output, the physical condition, all of it is downstream of thought patterns that were established weeks, months, and years before the results appeared. This means 2 things simultaneously. It means that the results you are experiencing right now are not a verdict on your ceiling. They are a reflection of mental habits that can be changed. And it means that the mental work you do starting today will not produce immediate visible results. It will produce results that become visible later, often when you have almost stopped expecting them. This delayed feedback loop is the reason most people give up. They change the habit, they don't see immediate results, and they conclude that the change isn't working. They return to the old pattern. And the old pattern produces, reliably, the old results. High performers are distinguished not by their immunity to this frustration, but by their understanding of it. They have internalized the concept of compound interest applied to behavior. The recognition that small, consistent inputs, maintained past the point where they feel productive, produce disproportionate outputs over time. They stay with the practice not because they can see the result yet, but because they understand the mechanism well enough to trust that the result is accumulating invisibly. You now understand the mechanism. What you do with that understanding is, entirely and without qualification, up to you. No one is going to install these habits for you. No audiobook, including this one, is going to do it. Insight is not transformation. Understanding is not change. The most important sentence in this entire audiobook is not something said in any of the 7 chapters. It is the sentence you say to yourself in the next 24 hours when the first opportunity to practice one of these habits arrives, and you either take it or you don't. That moment is coming. It may already be here. Here is what I want to leave you with, as a final thought rather than a final instruction. The gap between where you are and where you want to be is real. It is not a character flaw that the gap exists. Everyone has a gap. The people who close their gaps are not people without fear, without self-doubt, without bad days, without failure. They are people who have built a set of mental habits strong enough to keep moving through all of those things, not around them, not above them, but through them, with their eyes open, with enough self-knowledge to know what they're doing and why. That is available to you, not as a distant aspiration, as a choice you can make today and tomorrow and the day after that. 7 habits. 1 mind. Your life. The work begins now. Yet most people will finish this audiobook and do nothing. Not because they didn't understand it. Not because they disagreed with it. Not because the ideas weren't relevant to their lives. They will do nothing because of a gap that behavioral scientists have studied for decades and still find humbling in its persistence. The gap between intention and action. Between knowing and doing. Between the person you decide to become while listening to something like this, and the person you actually are at 8:15 the next morning when the alarm goes off and the phone is right there and the day has already started pulling at you. This gap has a name in psychology. It is called the intention-behavior gap. And understanding it is, in some ways, the most practical thing this audiobook can leave you with, because all 7 habits, no matter how well you've absorbed them, will remain theoretical until you have a strategy for crossing it. Here is what the research shows. A study conducted by psychologist Peter Gollwitzer at New York University found that people who formed what he called implementation intentions, Specific, concrete plans in the format of, when situation X arises, I will do behavior Y, were 2 to 3 times more likely to follow through on their intentions than people who simply stated that they intended to change. 2 to 3 times. Not for more motivation, not for more discipline, from one additional layer of specificity applied to the intention itself. I want to practice the identity habit is an intention. It will probably not change your behavior. When I sit down at my desk tomorrow morning, before I open anything else, I will write one sentence that begins, I am someone who. That is an implementation intention, and it will. The difference is not the size of the commitment. It is the precision of it. The brain, it turns out, responds very differently to vague aspirations and to specific plans. A vague aspiration lives in the prefrontal cortex as a kind of ambient pressure, present, occasionally motivating, easily overridden by more immediate demands. A specific plan, a clear when, where, and what, gets encoded more like a prepared response. When the trigger condition arrives, the behavior fires with far less friction. The decision has already been made. There is nothing left to negotiate. This is why the one action per chapter structure of this audiobook was not arbitrary. Each action was designed to be small enough to require almost no activation energy, specific enough to be unambiguous, and immediate enough to happen today rather than someday. Not because small actions change your life directly, but because small actions, done with intention, change your relationship with your own follow-through. And your relationship with your own follow-through is, ultimately, what your self-concept is built from. Every time you do what you said you would do, even something as small as writing one sentence before opening your phone, you cast a vote for the identity of someone who follows through. Over time, those votes accumulate into a belief. I am someone who does what they say. And once that belief is in place, the habits become self-sustaining in a way that no external motivation could ever produce. There is one more thing worth naming before this ends. It is something that does not appear in most books about performance or success, perhaps because it is uncomfortable, or perhaps because it resists easy framing. But it belongs here. The 7 habits in this audiobook are not just techniques for producing better results. They are, at their deepest level, practices of self-respect. The identity habit is an act of self-respect, the refusal to let circumstance define you. The self-talk habit is an act of self-respect, the decision to speak to yourself with the same precision and care you would offer someone you believe in. The fear habit is an act of self-respect, the acknowledgement that what frightens you is worth taking seriously rather than avoiding. The failure habit is an act of self-respect, the commitment to learn from your experience rather than be diminished by it. The focus habit is an act of self-respect, the recognition that your attention is worth protecting. The discomfort habit is an act of self-respect, the belief that you are capable of more than your comfort zone currently reflects. And the ritual habit is perhaps the deepest act of self-respect of all, the daily decision to show up for your own life with intention, rather than simply reacting to whatever it presents. When you practice these habits, you are not just optimizing for performance. You are practicing the belief that your mind is worth tending, that your life is worth designing, that the distance between who you are right now and who you are capable of becoming is not fixed, and that you are the one with the authority to close it. That belief is the foundation everything else is built on. Not confidence, not talent, not luck. The quiet, private, daily renewed conviction that you are worth the effort. You are. Now go make it true. If something in this audiobook landed for you, a single idea, a reframe, a habit you're committing to, leave a comment below and name it. Not for us, but for yourself. The act of articulating a commitment, even briefly, is itself a form of the identity habit. You are telling yourself and the world who you are choosing to be. And if you're taking notes, keep going. The notes are not a record of what you heard. They are the beginning of what you'll do.